Welcome to Cheques and Balances. I'm Michael Vincent. This is James Blair. In this week's episode, KiwiSaver.
So Mike, big announcement a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Government has indicated this for a long time, but KiwiSaver's been around since 2007. I know a lot of the providers have been angling, trying to work their way into that default KiwiSaver provider status. So we thought there'd be a great chance to talk about what's a default provider, who are these providers, how they pick them, but also a much wider range of why KiwiSaver is such an important tool for you.
Yeah, well, let me start with the simple question. What is a default provider?
It's a good question, Mike. So a default provider is really, so I think we've got about nearly 400,000 KiwiSaver customers who just went to their employer and said, I'd like KiwiSaver.
Sign me up.
Sign me up. And they haven't gone to any one particular provider of the 20 or so providers there are and go, I actually want to be with you and be in this low risk, medium risk or high risk fund.
Yep.
So they've just gone, I want KiwiSaver through their employer. When somebody does that, it randomly gets allocated currently to one of 9 different providers.
Okay.
So there's a few like, most of the banks are in there, Mercer, AMP, Fisher Funds, I think Kiwi Wealth is in there as well. And they get randomly allocated and they end up in a low risk profile. So if you are, for example, 20 and you got 45 years, assuming you've already bought your house, I don't know, maybe you can access it in the shorter term, but for the longer term, being in a low risk profile means your returns are going to be lower. The volatility, the ups and downs are going to be less. But you've got such a long way to run, Mike.
Yeah.
It really has huge implications for some people. It could be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars.
If they stay in that conservative fund versus a balance or a high growth fund.
Yeah.
So if I just go to my one of these default providers or my employer, sign up, I get put in this this low risk fund. I don't know what's happening. I don't have really any idea about it. The government have changed that now, so what have they changed it to?
Yeah, so at the moment we've got 9 providers. So they are BNZ, Booster, Westpac, Kiwi Wealth, ANZ, ASB, Fisher Funds, and Mercer. I'm nearly out of breath, Mike. So the 9 providers that have been around since 2007. Is a great business for these providers because it's something like 60, 70,000 Kiwis get randomly allocated to one of these providers. So great for them, lots of new clients. When KiwiSaver was in its infant stage, the government they were just like, we need to get this going. We don't want to look after the money ourselves, or we don't want to put people into high risk funds in case they turn around and get angry at us, randomly allocate. As KiwiSaver's become more mature and balances have got higher, government's gone, hey, you providers, those fees you're paying, how about we get them down? Okay. There's been a view on sustainability and going, fossil fuels, weapons, we shouldn't have those in our...
The good stuff.
Yeah, we shouldn't have those in our portfolios. So after a very long program, we've now got down to 6, which are BNZ, Booster, Westpac, Kiwi Wealth, Simplicity, and Smart Shares. So very interesting that, I thought Mercer and AMP would probably get the boot because their performance hasn't been great. Been a little late to the fee, reducing the fee party. Okay. But seeing some of those other providers, ANZ, ASB, go in particular, Fisher Funds, which I think is quite a good provider, very interesting to see them go.
So you mentioned fees, the government looking at kicking out potentially providers that had higher fees. You mentioned, the investment strategy, being around, I guess, ethical investing for lack of a better term. What do people really want to know, though, James, is out of those default providers, who would you go with?
So I'm going to give a bit of a wishy-washy answer, unfortunately, Mike. So it's important that you pick a provider that's right for you. So there's different investment strategies, which we spoke about in one of our I think it was Shares 101, where there's called a passive investment philosophy. So passive investing, have a look back if you want a longer explanation. Really low fees. Idea is we can't outperform the market. So that's a Simplicity and a Smart Shares. So if you believe that, then you should look for one of those providers. If you want one where you're paying a higher fee, but you've got people on the tool, they're actively managing, and the idea is outperform after their fee, like a Booster or a Milford, you're going to probably look at one of those providers. Okay. In addition to that, you're probably going to look at the communication you receive, the app, their ethical and socially responsible
Yep.
investment philosophy, if that's important to you. In addition to that, if I want to talk to somebody about my KiwiSaver, do they have a call center? Can I talk to an advisor? How does all of that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned two different investment strategies there, the active, the passive, that sort of thing. I think what's really key when you are looking at KiwiSavers is just to actually make an active choice about the KiwiSaver provider. Have a look at the different options, speak to an investment advisor perhaps, and really think about who you're going to go with and why. Potentially over the active versus the passive strategy. So let's say I've got I'm in a default provider at the moment, haven't thought about it for Lord knows how long. How do I switch? Much involved?
Not a lot. So you don't have to tell your employer. It's all linked through the IRD. So you just need to fill out the application form, which takes a couple of minutes, and then you don't need to tell your employer. Pretty quick, pretty straightforward.
Yep.
The thing that I'd really encourage is for everybody, who cares what the default providers are? You should be picking the provider that is right for you. If you're not sure which is the provider that's right for you, a tool like sorted.org compares all the different KiwiSavers, depending on returns, fees, kind of what you need in terms of service levels, a whole range of different options. And what's even more important than the provider is making sure you're in the right fund for your stage of life. So maybe if you're going to talk about buying a house in a second. Maybe if you're going to buy a house in 6 months, you should probably be in a lower risk KiwiSaver. Because as we found out in March last year, when COVID happened and markets dropped, about 40,000 Kiwis that went from high risk to low risk, and those people who couldn't settle on their homes, right?
Yeah, and that's something you've got to think about, which is, I guess your investment timeline and your strategy and that sort of thing. But absolutely, if you are coming up to needing those KiwiSaver funds as a deposit for a house, think about coming back to a more conservative fund, just so you're not likely to get hit with one of those very large drops, which means all of a sudden you don't have enough money to settle on your property.
Yeah, and then once you've bought that property, then you can, if you're comfortable with the ups and downs and the potential drops on losses on paper, maybe you look at a balanced or a more aggressive fund. If you're close to retirement, maybe you're looking at a lower risk fund. But if you're close to retirement as well, you might go, well, I have these other assets I can access at 65.
Yeah.
I'm still comfortable taking a higher level of risk with my KiwiSaver. So picking the provider, making sure you're in the right fund, and then also kind of reviewing it regularly, making sure that your provider and the fund is still doing all the things that you need it to do.
And I'm going to chip in there with one quick thing. So I've been asked this actually a couple of times over the years, which is, I don't know where my KiwiSaver is. How do I find it? You can find out via the IRD website.
Yeah. In addition to that, I would just say if you're not sure where it is, go on the sorted tool and just pick one from scratch, and all the money will get transferred across because it's all linked to your IRD number, as you alluded to.
Yep.
So Mike, I've spoken a little bit about the new default scheme, making an active choice, things to think about.
Yep.
I mean, you're the mortgage man. Tell me about how mortgages impact KiwiSaver.
Yeah, so when you're purchasing your first home, if you're wanting to use, if you need that deposit, whether it's 10%, 20%, you can actually use your KiwiSaver as part of that. You'll need to leave a minimum of $1,000 in there, but usually people empty the whole thing, chuck it down on the house, and just help to get into their first home. So, I think that's about 7,000 members since March 2020.
Have used their KiwiSaver for their first home.
Yeah, so
that's pretty cool, isn't it?
It is, and it's great, right? Because you're getting it's an automatic saving, comes straight out of your pay. You don't see it. You do see it, but you don't. Hopefully, you don't feel it too much. So it is a really good way to try and save up these deposits. We get a few questions about each, when it comes to time to actually use it. So there's a couple of different ways you can use it. The first way is if you're going to use it for the deposit. So this is after you've won at auction, you've purchased the house off plans, you need to make that initial down payment to secure the house until settlement. If you do that, you need to contact your KiwiSaver provider as early as possible. I'd recommend doing it, as soon as you essentially get the approval or are going through that mortgage approval process, because what you don't want to do is be left needing to make a lump sum repayment 24 hours after you've won the auction, and your KiwiSaver provider is like, this is going to take us a week to process. So that's something to consider there. If you are using it for settlement on the property, so you've got enough cash savings or liquid savings to make that down payment, and you've got, let's call it a month, 4 weeks, 2 months until settlement, you've got a little bit more time, so you can notify your KiwiSaver and they will organise everything on settlement day to get all that sussed for you. But once again, like everything with this, I'm going to recommend that you do it as soon as possible. The later you leave it, the more stress there is, the more chance things are going to go wrong.
So Mike, a scenario that I see quite a bit as well is when maybe partner A has their first home and partner B doesn't. If they're buying a house together, can partner B, who's never owned a home, use their KiwiSaver?
Yeah, absolutely. So it comes down to the individual buying the house, not essentially the ownership of the house.
Right.
So yeah, they can chip in, and that's a general statement. There's probably some hooks in instances where you can't, but generally speaking, yes, you can.
Yeah, it depends on the ownership structure and a couple of other things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing to think about if you are using your KiwiSaver, like we sort of talked about before, was that fund mix as you're leading up to using it, so pulling back a little bit. The other thing to think about is the lock-in period. So you're going to need to be contributing to KiwiSaver for at least 3 years before you can use it as a deposit on your home loan or to purchase your house. That doesn't have to be 3 consecutive years. I might have contributed for 2 years, moved overseas, come back, contributed for another year. I'm then eligible to use those funds as a deposit.
Okay. And then also look at the first home buyer grants and the likes on the government website to see if the criteria work for you, which we've spoken about a little bit in the past.
Yeah, we have.
Great. So a little bit about buying your first home and KiwiSaver. I just want to touch on a couple of other things. KiwiSaver is a phenomenal tool. If you think about before KiwiSaver, you were responsible, and you still are to an extent, but you've got some help there. You've got some help in terms of 3% of your salary getting sacrificed, the employer putting in 3% as a minimum, and also the government chucking in $500 a year. It's a great way to build your wealth over time. So making sure you make those contribution levels, making sure you pick the right fund, low to high risk that's appropriate for you, and a provider that works for you, because you're going to be paying them fees for a very long time. You should align with them. The last bit I'll touch on, Mike, before we wrap up, is those who are self-employed. Coming back to, there's a little bit of money going away for you that might end up, I've just got some stats here as well, which I'll include. If you're in a low-risk KiwiSaver and contributing 3%, this is for someone who's 20, earning an average of $80,000 across their lifetime. They might have somewhere around $500,000, $550,000 by 65. If they're in a balanced fund and contributing that level, that might be somewhere between $850,000 and $900,000. And a more aggressive fund could be as much as kind of $1.3, $1.4 million. So it's that kind of contribution over a long period of time towards your KiwiSaver can make a huge difference. If you are self-employed and you don't get the 3%, you don't want to have to kind of put 6% aside for yourself. It's just important that you're not just spending all of your money. Obvious statement to make, but it happens quite a bit because there's not that what's in it for me. So making sure whether it's a managed fund or an index, or you're paying down your mortgage more aggressively, that you are putting money aside. Great. So before we wrap up, Mike, I just really want to reiterate, KiwiSaver is a great tool to use. If you think about it, if you're an employee, you're getting 3% from your employer. Yes, you're sacrificing 3%, but it's a little bit that can go a long way.
You barely notice it.
Yeah. And then the government puts in $500 a year. If you've got a long way to run until retirement, you pick a good provider, you're in the right risk profile for your stage of life. I mean, I've got some numbers here, Mike, that are even a low-risk KiwiSaver, this is for a 20-year-old earning an average of $80,000 across their life. By 65, might have somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000. If you're in a medium-risk fund and you contribute 3%, you might have somewhere between $800,000 and $900,000. And an aggressive fund at 3% is like into that kind of 7-figure number, maybe 1.2 to 1.4. So it's just really important to think about. We did not have this tool pre-2007. It was completely on us to organize our own retirement, and that's still true to an extent. We don't want to be completely dependent on KiwiSaver for our retirement, but it can be a great tool, especially with those that maybe have a little bit of a tight budget, to make those contribution levels. For those that are self-employed, I know there's not the benefit of the contributions from an employer, and maybe you're just putting in the $100. Just make sure you have some other structure where you're saving for your retirement and your future.
Yeah.
Maybe it's paying down the mortgage more aggressively. Maybe it's contributing to a managed fund or an index fund. But you just got to make sure that you're, I guess, looking after yourself and you're going to be okay over the long term.
Absolutely.
So we're going to wrap it up there. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. If you've got any questions, pop them in the comments section. Send us an email. We've got a very exciting special guest next week, Mike.
We do.
So we're really looking forward to that. You'll have to stay tuned and see what that's all about. And we'll see you next week.
Cheers.